So good morning, everyone. I hope you're ready for an exciting talks on carbon pricing this morning. This webinar is co-organized by the University of Iceland and Reykjavik University. And my name is Brynhildur Davíðsdóttir, Professor of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Iceland, and I will be your host today. This webinar is the first of a webinar series that is part of the project Nordic Stocktake Visions, Pathways to Climate Neutrality, funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. The agenda of the webinar is as follows. We will begin by some welcoming words by Anna-Marie Gran from the Nordic Council of Ministers. Then Daði Már Kristoffersson, Professor of Economics at the University of Iceland, will remind us why carbon pricing is important and give us an overview over the state of carbon pricing in the Nordic countries. Then Matti Liski, Professor of Economics at Aalto University, will follow, and the title of his talk is National and EU Climate Policies in Conflict. The third talk is by Thorsten Hasforth from Concito, and he will discuss agriculture and carbon pricing. The title of his talk is Agriculture and Carbon Pricing, the Danish Case. And last but not least, we have Sigríður Ingibjörg Ingadóttir from the Federation of State and Municipal Employees in Iceland, who will discuss carbon pricing in the context of justice dimensions. The title of her talk is Just a Carbon Pricing Policy or a Just Carbon Pricing Policy. In terms of logistics, we will allow questions after each talk, depending, of course, how well we're doing on time. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll open up for questions to all our speakers. You will ask questions by using the Q&A prompt in Zoom and use it to send in written questions either during or after each talk, and I will then read your questions out loud. And please note that the webinar is being recorded. So let's begin by some welcoming words by Anna-Marie Gran from the Nordic Council of Ministers. Anna? The screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Brynhildur. Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce this webinar today on carbon pricing. My name is Anna Gran, and I work from the Nordic Council of Ministers Working Group of Climate and Air. So this is definitely a relevant topic for us. And as a civil servant in the Nordic context, I don't know how many times I've written speaking bullet points that includes carbon pricing has been a part of the Nordic countries' policies since the 90s, or since I don't know when. With minimum 10 times we have different quotes related to this topic, and still today, 2023. Carbon pricing for some sectors can be extremely sensitive in some countries. So I really look forward to this co-Nordic joint input of how one can plan and adjust the carbon pricing policy. And as Brynhildur mentioned, this webinar is a part of a bigger project that's called Nordic Stocktake Visions. And then the Nordic Council of Ministers we've asked some of the most brilliant think tanks and research institutions in the Nordics to, number one, help us to take stock of how far have we come with regards to climate action so far. What could be done co-Nordically to enhance our work towards climate neutrality, and also to help us decipher or create Nordic narratives of if we'll make it, or hopefully when we'll make the carbon neutral society, what would it look like? How will it be? How could we demystify this mysterious but so much needed climate neutral society? And within this process, we have a variety of initiatives, and this webinar series is one of those. So one of 5 webinar series, and I think we will get a very short overview of all the webinars later, so I won't go into detail with that. But this Climate Neutrality Nordic Stocktake project, it is one of the stepping stones to implement and to support the Nordic vision. The Nordic Council of Ministers and the Nordic countries, they've decided that this region of ours, we will be the most sustainable and integrated region of the world in 2030. That's an ambitious goal, and we would love to have some competence in that, but we're on our way. This project, though, will maybe show us that we haven't come as far as we would have hoped for. And everything we do within the Nordic Council of Ministers must support this objective in one way or another. So this project, in how we can share knowledge and get wiser when it comes to different climate solutions, is one excellent initiative to support the Nordic countries in this. And when we started this Nordic Stocktake Visions project, it was actually already last year. The first thoughts came up, and then we had a kickstart at the Nordic Pavilion at COP27, where we made a series of talks in different aspects, trying to picture the path within different angles. And what we always asked them was, well, if you could just give one or two recommendations to the Nordic ministers, what should they focus on the coming? I don't know how many, but there were many where carbon pricing was definitely one of those. A robust price on carbon is needed and one of the important solutions towards climate neutrality. So now I will, with no further ado, I will not keep you waiting to actually get the input. So I wish you a good seminar, and thank you so much to the University of Iceland and Reykjavik University to arrange this, and to all the other project team members within the project. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is Daði Már Kristoffersen, Professor of Economics at University of Iceland. And as I already said, the title of his talk is Carbon Pricing in the Nordic Countries. So Daði, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Brynhildur. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Are they in full screen?
Yes.
Very good. So I'm very honored to be here today and to have an opportunity to discuss this enormously important topic, carbon pricing, with you. As Brynhildur mentioned, carbon pricing, at least from the perspective of my profession, economics, is one of the most important tools to achieve our climate goals and to do it in the most efficient way possible. Now, the reason why we think pricing is important is that it creates an incentive to reach our goals in the least cost, most efficient manner possible, simply by internalizing the external effect created by greenhouse gas emissions. So this is why economists all over the world have promoted this policy. However, the implementation has been slower than we expected. And I think the Nordic countries are a case in point why this is so difficult. So as Anna indicated, I think the political climate in the Nordic countries is favorable for climate action, and we are by no standard laggards when it comes to climate action. However, there are realities that have made this challenging, and what I'm going to talk about today is simply what is the situation like, how has it developed, and maybe some words about the future and why this has proven to be so challenging. So here is a map I picked up somewhere from the internet showing carbon pricing. These are percentage of sectors that are covered by a carbon tax of 60 euros. And as you can see by the colors, there is some variation with Scandinavia, but there are no black areas or no very dark areas. So carbon pricing is widespread in the Nordic countries. What I'm going to talk about today, as I mentioned, is carbon pricing in the Nordic countries compared to the rest of the world, and then the difference between the countries within the region and the challenges going forward. Now, here is some background. The Nordics, as we know, are welfare states, probably some of the most developed welfare states in the world. They have very high government spending and relatively high taxes. At the same time, the Nordics are small open economies. And what do I mean by small open economies? Well, small, I don't probably have to explain, but open means that a relatively large share of their GDP is international trade. They export a lot, they import a lot. And what has made the Nordics into the welfare states they are, that measure very well, compare very well to the rest of the world, is a combination of a welfare state and a business-friendly and internationally competitive industry. A business-friendly environment and international competitive industry. So if you have a welfare state, you have high taxes, you somehow have to design your tax system in an efficient way. Now, those of you with some backgrounds in economic may have heard of the term deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is basically the cost of taxation. So when you tax work, you discourage people from working. When you tax consumption, you discourage people from consumption. When you tax production, you discourage people from production. So this is the deadweight loss. And we, of course, accept that because we think that the services that we are financing through our taxes are worth the deadweight loss. However, it is quite important to design a tax system in such a way that you minimize deadweight loss. And the Nordics have been quite good at this. They have an efficient tax code. So they focus taxation on goods with low elasticity of demand, meaning that the impact of taxes on consumption is quite small. You can put on a tax and it doesn't really change. The demand has a minimum effect and therefore a small deadweight loss. So what are typical goods with low elasticities of demand? Well, energy has a low elasticity of demand everywhere in the world. So we have historically been quite willing to tax energy and especially fuel. With the exception of Norway, none of the Nordics produce their own oil, so it's kind of been a double dividend to have high taxation. You have an efficient tax because there's low elasticity of demand, and also you're reducing your reliance on imported energy. All the Nordics are, however, rich in renewables, so this makes actually perfect sense from that point as well. Now, I want you to keep this in mind when we start looking at the development of carbon taxes. So here's a figure from an OECD report from 2021, and what you're going to see is that I'm an economist, I read a lot of OECD reports. So here you see this measure, it's called CPS 60, and again, it's the amount or the relative amount of emissions that is covered by a carbon price that is 60 euros or higher. And if I emphasize the Nordics in this picture, and the picture shows two things. It shows the CPS 60 and it shows the change in CPS 60 from 2015 to 2018. And if we put the Nordics in there, you can firstly see that some of them, specifically Iceland, Norway, and Denmark, have a relatively high CPS 60. And that for Norway, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, it has been increasing over time. None of the Nordics have a low CPS 60 compared to the rest of the world. In a sense, we are starting the talk off by positioning the Nordics as countries with active carbon pricing. Okay, if we look into more details here, here we have a picture showing again the coverage of carbon pricing. And this is contrary to the CPS 60, this is kind of a CPS 0 or CPS plus 0 plus, meaning just any carbon price is covered here. And if we put the Nordics into this world map of carbon pricing, you can see that they are all well above average. And actually, Iceland is there on top. This came as a sort of a surprise to me, but in a sense, what follows will kind of fill into this picture. So carbon pricing, obviously a method that the Nordics use. So there is carbon pricing on most emissions. And there are basically two components. There are carbon taxes, mainly on inputs, and as I will show you, mainly on fuel. And also all the Nordics participate in EU's ETS system, either because they are members of EU or like Norway and Iceland are members of the EEZ, which makes and have adopted the ETS. Now, the interesting thing is that coverage by Iceland is, according to the OECD, 98.7%, which is very impressive, but its EPS 60 is only 57%, indicating that certainly there is a carbon price, but it is modest. And you can see that the EPS 60 is much lower than the total carbon price coverage in all the Nordic countries. And what we will basically see here today is that yes, we have carbon pricing, and no, it is not very high, with one exception. Here is the revenue from carbon taxes. So then we are kind of basically looking more at how impactful is the carbon pricing. And you can see here the revenues are measured in shares of GDP, gross domestic product. So you can see that there is a significant variation. Some countries in the world are still subsidizing emissions, while others, like Estonia, have a relatively significant share of GDP covered or generated by carbon pricing. Now, here are the Nordics. And again, we kind of get this strange figure that we saw that for example, for Iceland, that the coverage of carbon pricing was almost 100%, but the income is very moderate, indicating that the carbon prices are there, but they are relatively modest. So we get a completely different picture from this, actually, with Finland with the highest share of GDP in carbon price revenue. So we can say generally high, but not very high. And there's another thing in this picture that I want to indicate to you or point out to you, and that is the kind of, I'm colorblind, so I'm not very good at this, but kind of grayish, bluish part of the bars there are actually carbon taxes. And please, if you look at the lines underlining each Nordic country, notice that the Nordic countries use carbon taxes more than most other countries in the world. There are some exceptions. Canada, for example, uses carbon taxes. But other than that, it is mostly the Nordics that apply carbon taxes, which is quite interesting and a good thing. The rest use other systems. like, for example, ETS systems, and of course also the Nordics are part of that. I would like to point out to you, or just to emphasize again what I said earlier, that electricity generation in the Nordics relies more on renewables than in most other countries. And of course, the renewable sources are not going to be either forced into participating in any ETS or really pay any significant carbon taxes. So that kind of has to be taken into account, that the Nordics are in a very nice position there, and that may explain or be part of the explanation why the overall revenue is so moderate. Now, our carbon taxes are mostly focused on one thing: fuel, and we are absolute world beaters when it comes to taxation on fuel. Now, there you can, in this picture, you can see both the carbon or the pricing of carbon in the Nordics, actually the rest of the world, but the Nordics are underlined there. And you can also see the extent of the carbon tax itself. It's kind of this green part of each bar. Most of the Nordics have very high carbon taxes. I would, however, be quite careful in interpreting that as aggressive climate policy, because it has always been, we have always taxed fuel quite aggressively for reasons that I've already explained to you, that have absolutely nothing to do with carbon emissions and predate any discussion about climate change. Have mostly to do with things like low elasticity of demand of fuel, simply that it is efficient to fund government projects by taxing fuel. So I really can't generalize here, but I can take the Icelandic case and categorically state that our carbon tax is mostly a rebranding of taxes we already had. Now, having said that, I will admit that a bold move from the Icelandic government was to apply the carbon tax to all fuel use. That was done in 2010, in a period where increasing taxes was seen as a necessity in Iceland, and this was probably a very good idea. But for the road traffic part, it didn't really mean any significant increase in price, because it mainly was a rebranding of fees that had already been applied to fuel. So, you know, I wouldn't specifically say this was greenwashing, but it's certainly, if I was a politician, which actually in my free time, it's quite tempting to rebrand taxes that you already have and call them carbon taxes, because it makes you look good in OECD reports, and doesn't cost you anything, because who cares what the tax is called if it doesn't increase? So carbon taxes are high in the Nordics, but are mostly applied to fuel, and may or may not be greenwashing. I don't know. It's at least if I take the Icelandic case, it's partly true, partly not. Fuel taxes have historically been high. That kind of supports that claim, but they have also been increasing both in quantity and scope. So that kind of makes my point incorrect. We are probably somewhere in the gray zone when it comes to the actual answer. The Nordics have a relatively comprehensive system of carbon prices, but relatively modest for everything except fuel. And I'm going to come back to this point, but I think that what you need to keep in mind here is that these societies support, carbon pricing, but they are very reluctant to take initiatives that hurt their international competitiveness because they are small open economies. So if we go into the specifics, and as Anna mentioned here this morning, carbon pricing in the Nordics started very early. Was that because it was really easy to rebrand fuel taxation? I don't know. Again, that's something for discussion. But Norway was actually the first to introduce carbon taxes in 1991, and Sweden actually followed suit. Now, the picture you see at the bottom shows two things. It shows the level of taxation measured on the left-hand axis, euros per ton of CO2 equivalent, and on the right axis you measure the emissions. So we kind of have two things there: carbon pricing and the importance of the emissions of that sector in the gray bars. So the kind of blue and light gray bars are carbon pricing. The dark gray bars are the emissions. And this is a picture you will see again and again and again for the Nordics. Fuel, really aggressive. The rest, relatively modest. And you can see it again here. And here, actually, I have to admit, I don't really have a detailed enough knowledge of the Swedish carbon pricing scheme, but buildings come there as a very high bar. But you can see, again, the same picture: fuel very high, the rest relatively modest, with the exception of the building sector. Like I said, a long history of taxing energy, introduced carbon taxes in the early 90s and participates in the EU's ETS. Denmark, same picture again. Very aggressive for fuel, relatively modest for the rest. There is an initiative now to increase carbon pricing in Denmark, and actually quite aggressively into the 2030s. But the current situation is, as you can see there at the bottom, aggressive on fuel, relatively modest on the rest. Finland, again, aggressive on fuel, relatively modest on the rest. Various carbon taxation. There are a lot of exemptions. There are actually also exemptions in Denmark, and varying levels of taxation by sector, and then they participate in the ETS. And finally, Iceland, again, exactly the same picture. Aggressive on fuel, modest on the rest. Maybe the only thing I would mention there is that for agriculture and fisheries, since 2010, they pay a carbon tax as to the same extent as the rest. And you can see kind of that the blue part of the road transport bar and the agriculture and fisheries bar is kind of the same. It's the same tax on all fuel usage. So then I come to my final slide here. If you think about the future challenges of applying this very efficient, theoretically very good way to meet our climate goals, that is to apply carbon pricing, there are two significant challenges that I think have colored the development of, in the Nordics. You have very good political support for policy, but there are two things that impede it. One is the distributional effects. It is clear that however you look at it, fuel as a share of people's expenditure increases as your income decreases. That is, when you increase carbon taxes on fuel, you disproportionately affect the disposable income of the poorest parts of society, and that is frowned upon. We don't like that. That goes against kind of the social contract in the Nordic countries. We do it all the time, but still, it's not something we do without having a discussion about it. And the second is that because the Nordics are small open economies and are really focused on international trade and have benefited enormously from internationalization, they don't like putting regulation on their own domestic industry that reduces their international competitiveness. They hate that. So even though it would make sense to even out the burden of carbon pricing in our societies, we don't do it because we don't like taxing industry. When I say we, I mean our governments don't like it because, well, it is, of course, slaughtering the cow instead of milking it. And that, in the long run, as any of us probably are aware of, is not really a good strategy. So how will this develop over time? Well, I think we have already kind of seen what is going to happen. We are going to follow any international or broad coalition for carbon pricing, absolutely. But we are not going to go 1 millimeter in front of that development, not one. We are just going to follow it. Because, well, if everyone has to pay a carbon tax, we can pay a carbon tax. We certainly support the carbon tax, but not for our domestic industry alone. Secondly, I think, and it already is apparent, at least in Icelandic political discussion, that higher fuel taxes, well, for the first, they are already very, very high. Secondly, their disproportionate effect on the least well-off in society means that they are very unpopular. And probably in terms of long-run strategy, not even a very good strategy, because what you're going to do is make people, you're going to erode the support for action in fighting emissions. So I hate being the economist saying this, but this is kind of the reality of the situation. If we look at recent development, both, well, I'm familiar with kind of the initiatives in Norway and in Iceland, and there are probably in other countries as well. If you look at the initiatives to try to reduce emissions from the traffic sector, it has mostly come through subsidies, not through taxation. Subsidies, mostly of electric vehicles, that are broadly used and are, of course, much more popular. It is much, much nicer to get money from the government than having to pay money to the government. Now, in the long run, these strategies are, of course, not sustainable. How are we going to address this issue? I do not know, but I hope a seminar like this one can help us on the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daði, for this excellent overview over carbon pricing in the Nordics. We are running a bit short on time, so I'm going to go directly to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Matti Litsky. He is a professor of economics at Aalto University School of Business, where he's actually currently head of department. And the title of his talk is National and EU Climate Policies in Conflict. So Matti, your screen is yours, and please share your slides.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here today. Let me see if I can open my slides. you can hopefully see them now. Full screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm currently actually not any longer the head of the department. I'm luckily just stepped down. So, but I'm still the professor here. And thank you, Daddy, very much for your talk. It was very inspiring, and very happy to see that my talk is complementary to your insightful presentation. This is the title here is indicating that I will be talking about national and EU level policies, but it's very much about carbon pricing and how to reconcile the designs that we have at the EU level with those that we have at the national level, in particular because at the national level we often have targets that differ from the targets that are set at the EU level. And this, oops, now you see, let me see. Well, now I need to see if I can make it work. This is looking a bit funny. Let me see. Maybe we'll proceed this way. Hopefully you can see the slides well.
Yes, we can, Matti. This is fine.
This way. Okay, the background is that this is based on a report that we wrote to or actually an article at the Nordic Economic Policy Review from last spring. And in that article, we reported our policy work that we've been doing over past 4 years or so, even a bit more, through our science policy platform. It has a name. The name is Aalto Economic Institute, and it's something that helps our professors to work with the policymakers in a structured way. And typically, we enter a contract with the public sector when we advise them, as thereby there's a little bit more formal sort of record on what we've done. And we have been working related to carbon prices on the transport sector. 2019, for the first time, we wrote a report to the Ministry of Transportation about how to achieve the national emissions reduction target that we have in Finland, which is to halve emissions by year 2030. And there we propose a national trading system for emissions coming from the transport sector. And then in the second report, they were very much interested in seeing what are the distributional consequences of introducing such a system, and what are the distributional consequences of carbon taxation more generally. And I'm going to cover that as well in this talk. Then we also have been writing about and working with the policymakers on emissions from the construction and the building sector. And there we also proposed a scheme for national emissions trading. I will hopefully be able to convey this story that these two sectors, they tell a very different story. For the transport sector, we propose a national approach, which can be linked to the EU level system. Whereas for the construction and building sector, we propose that you can very much rely on the carbon pricing coming from the EU level. We also been working on the electricity sector, because in the title I said that we had lessons from 3 sectors, but I left the electricity out of this presentation because I think in the interest of time we have to focus on these 2. And electricity, it's a bit more complicated, many more details that we don't have so much time to cover here. And in some sense, I think the transport and construction are also somewhat more, perhaps less familiar to the broader audience. So let's overall, the lessons from this work is that we are trying to draw conclusions on how to reconcile the national targets and then the EU level climate policy goals. And the starting point is that the national policy goals, they follow from like local aspirations or national sector-specific commitments. If you think about the latter, the national sector-specific commitments, for example, in Finland, we have a commitment that the transport sector has to reduce its emissions by 50%, and this commitment is to the EU. It means that some other sectors have perhaps not been, the policymakers in Finland have decided to make this commitment for the transport sector, and partly because the agriculture is not willing to reduce so much. And this is it's a binding commitment, and we need to reach it hopefully in a cost-efficient way. And if we rely on the EU level emissions trading, that is in planning for the transport sector, then there is no guarantee that we will meet that goal under the EU level emissions pricing. And if this is the case, then we will have to pay penalties at the EU level for not reaching the target for transport. And there is a clear conflict. So if we have a sort of national level target, then the solution also has to be national. We need to have the tools at the national level to reach the target. The story is very different for the construction sector, as you will see. So this is pretty much what I said already, that the transport sector, the solution is national, whereas for the construction and buildings, our argument is that for that sector, the use of energy during the lifetime of the building is very much covered already by the emissions from the use of energy is covered by the EU ETS. So there's no need to separately make an intervention and design overlapping regulations on those emissions. But what is left out from this is the emissions coming from the construction time, and this is where you can add additional regulation at the national level. So there are, when we look deeper into the sort of a little bit more micro level view at the carbon pricing, we see that there are big differences between the sectors, and they are different. And these differences, they justify a different approach and market design solutions, instrument design solutions for different sectors. And let's look deeper into this transport now, because we did quite a bit of work, and we still continue this work using micro data on the emissions from the transport sector. So the first fact is what I said already, that we need to cut our emissions by 50% by 2030, and that's a pretty short time window. So you have to think carefully how you're going to reach that in a few years' time. Overall, the government has the goal of making Finland carbon neutral by 2035. By the way, this was the goal of the previous government. So the current government has not been so. We have a new government, and but I suppose the goal is still there, but they have not been emphasizing it so much. But nevertheless, this is I'm sure the administration is still working towards this goal. And this implies a heavy pressure to reduce traffic emissions, because traffic causes like 40% of the burden sharing sector's emissions in Finland. So the second fact is that there's these cars that are producing emissions. It's interestingly sort of concentrated that you have like 25% of all the cars are producing this half of the emissions. So if you could reduce the emissions of that 1/4 of the cars, you could reach the target. And here, underlying this figure is micro data, where we have data on all of the about 3 million cars in Finland, and we have data on the kilometers that have been driven with these cars, and we have data on the technology. So we know the emissions that are coming out of each car, and here we are ranking the cars in the descending order according to the total emissions. And you see that when you have gone from the left to the right, so that you're covered about 25% of the cars, you have accumulated about 50% of the emissions. It would be important to know where these cars are, so that you could tailor some instruments that are sort of targeting precisely those cars, but that's not clear how to do that without having full information about everyone's opportunities and driving patterns and so forth. The second fact is that that we have very old fleet of cars. Hopefully you can see this figure. So we have the car age here from 0 to year all the way to 30 years old cars. And you can see emissions coming from different age classes of cars. You see that newer cars up to, let's say, up to 5 years here, they are the emissions are increasing, and even further. These are total emissions coming from driving, coming from, you know, depending also on the technology of the car. And you see when you go to really old cars, then the emissions start to come down from these cars, because you're not driving these very old cars very much. And you see that we have a large number of cars in all age classes. The median or the average I think the average age of the car is about 13 years at this point. So our fleet of cars is very old. Of course, the older cars are somewhat more emission intensive, but nevertheless, you tend to drive more the newer cars. So they tend to kind of offset each other. And this means that if the government wants to reach this target of cutting emissions by 50%, you really need to impact the emissions coming from this fleet of old cars. So you need to cut deep into the to the fleet of old cars. So it's not going to be solved by new technologies only, but you need to have a system in place that is going to affect how you drive with your cars, and potentially also if you should move to use public transportation or think about different, you know, all kinds of options for commuting, like where you decide to live and work and so forth. So this is a deep change that if you want to implement it, then it's going to have an impact on how much you're driving, where you're driving to, and how these old cars are being used. And what we proposed to the government is that we should create a system of licenses where the retailers should hold a license for the right to sell any liter of gasoline or diesel based on the carbon content of the fuel. And then the number of licenses would be gradually declining over years, the number of licenses in circulation, so that by 2030 you would have reduced the number of licenses by 50%. So this system would, of course, have an impact on the prices of gasoline at the pump, but nevertheless it would leave it to the market to decide how to adjust to the target, and it would have the advantage that you would reach the target for sure. So there are lots of justifications. The first one is that the target is national, so we really need to reach the target. You cannot rely on the EU level, potential EU level emission trading on the transport sector. The technologies that we're using for driving is that those technologies are very much given. If we decide to subsidize certain technologies, we are not going to impact very much the development of those technologies. We have to pretty much take as given the whatever technologies are available. We just need to pick up the technologies that are best for reaching the target. The public funds are also scarce. We cannot afford to buy new cars to everyone, so we have to use penalties and collect also funds that are related to driving. So the government would be collecting funds by auctioning off these licenses. And this would create multiple adjustment channels. You would think twice before you drive every weekend to your summer cottage. So you could think about sort of using more public transport. You would think about if you think about sort of who is holding what type of car, this would have an impact on the car market, because those cars that are consuming that are very fuel inefficient, they would go into the hands of those who are not driving very much. Whereas those who are driving a lot, they would have an incentive to buy more fuel-efficient cars. And all of these adjustments are difficult to achieve without giving a decent price signal in the market. We think that the overlap with the potential EU-level policy is not a problem because we can create a linkage between the two trading programs, one here at home and then the other one at the EU level. Of course, you have to control the flows of emission rights between these two systems, but that's not impossible. And the control of that flow of these emission rights would depend on the on how well we are doing with respect to the target. So we think that this kind of proposal would lead to cost efficiency, and it would, I think there are good chances to address the distributional issues. And because it's a domestic system and we have very good tools for redistribution. And there's something related to this sort of transport sector that we think that there's an automatic sort of favorable mechanism that helps to overcome the distributional concerns. And let me explain that next. So if we think about the redistribution that is potentially caused by this kind of system, we need to look a little bit at the fleet of cars and where the emissions are more precisely coming from. So our argument is that the new technologies will be mostly adopted by those who are in the higher income groups. And when they buy the new vehicles, they will, of course, stop producing CO2 if these new vehicles are electric vehicles. And when you have a system of tradable rights like this, then that would mean that there would be a downward pressure for the emission price caused by every new electric vehicle coming to the system. And this in turn implies that those who cannot afford to buy these electric vehicles, they would have more of these emissions rights available. So it would be it would be easier for them to then continue driving with their old vehicles. And it would be like an automatic mechanism that helps the society to overcome the distributional concerns that are related to the emission target in this sector. So the way we try to quantify this argument is that we're looking at this vehicle ownership and also the kilometers driven by each vehicle, and we are connecting these vehicles to socioeconomic variables. And from this data, we can look at where these emissions are coming from. For example, here you have 10 income groups, like the first group is earning up to 10,000 euros, the second group up to 20,000 euros and so forth, and the last group is 100,000 euros or more. And from this figure, you can see that how many tons of emissions per year comes to the household where this car is located. So you see the median. This kind of box includes like 50% of the population in each income group, and the dot is the mean. So the median here is around 2 tons per year for the two lowest income groups, and then it gradually rises, and you see that it goes more than doubles, and actually the average emissions actually increase even more. So you see that it is really these higher income groups earning 60,000 euros or more that are producing most of the emissions. And that is actually quite surprising how strong that impact is. And it's coming mostly from kilometers, because if you look at the technologies, the mean emissions per vehicle, which is measured as grams per kilometer, the sort of mean or median emissions per vehicle is not changing so much when you move to higher income groups. Of course, there's more sort of dispersion within each income group, because there are those Hummers and then there are those electric vehicles or hybrids, and they are of course creating more dispersions because most of these cars are in the higher income groups. But this is not because of this, the technology is not changing it's not behind this result that the higher income people are causing more emissions, but it's more the driving. Because if you look at the driving patterns, you see that lower incomes are driving on average like 10,000 kilometers per year, whereas the higher income groups are driving 3 times more on average. And this is it's a big impact. Actually, 30,000 kilometers is a lot of driving, and if an average person is driving that much, then they are really driving a lot. I don't know what I should be doing to drive that much, but that's amazingly big difference between the income groups, and this is the reason that explains the increase in emissions. And we argue that because the electric vehicles they go to this higher income group people, then they automatically will be adopted by people who are wealthier, and that means that those people who do not have the financial resources to buy the electric vehicles, they would not have to pay for the emission rights that much. And with the tax, you cannot easily achieve that. So let's sort of discuss the construction and buildings. The argument here is that very shortly that the use of the building is causing most of the lifetime emissions, and these are covered by these are coming from electricity use and heating, and these are covered by EU ETS. So there is no need to regulate those sources of emissions directly. And demolition of the building is also regulated separately. So the only part missing is the construction part. And this is something that for which you might want to design another emissions trading or some other emission control program. And we are proposing a detailed program for that and how it can be linked to the EU level trading. And if you want to read our report, you can see that we have a detailed proposal how that can be incorporated into the system where we are inspecting buildings, and then this would be a place to verify the emission rights. Now I'm concluding, and my conclusions relate to the fact that the desire to respect national commitments should be respected, and therefore we should allow domestic governments to create price signals for reaching their domestic targets. But it doesn't mean that we have to ignore the EU level regulations, but we can build these domestic instruments in a way that they can be linked to the EU level programs. And if you want to look at more at the details, then our article in the Nordic Economic Policy Review can be helpful. And you can learn about electricity markets, our lessons for the electricity markets as well from there. I think my time is up. Half an hour has been used. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Matti, for this excellent talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go directly to our third speaker. And our third speaker is Torsten Hasworth. And he's head of analysis of Concito in Denmark. And the title of his talk is Agriculture and Carbon Pricing, the Danish Case. The screen is yours, Torsten.
Yes, thank you very much. I assume you can hear me and see my slide.
Yeah, yes, we can. Thank you.
I believe I've been given. No. I'm not on. That's pretty incredible. It decided to crash as I was about to speak, which thank you, Zoom. I'm trying again. I'm sharing. Yes. Can you hear me? Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can hear you and see the slides. Thank you.
I will try again. What I believe I've been given 10 minutes. I will try to keep within those 10 minutes, actually. Unfortunately, the first minute has now been used on a technical issue, but I'm I'm going to talk about agriculture. Agriculture is currently a very hot debate in Denmark. I'm going to talk to you about where the issue stands regarding taxation of agriculture in Denmark, how it relates to the EU, how we in Concito think about this particular issue. I was 13 to 15 years ago, I worked in a secretariat of what was then called the Climate Commission or Commission for Climate Change, which looked at, is it feasible for Denmark to become, to live up to IPCC demands by 2050? And the interesting thing was, those 13, 15 years ago, that commission looked at agriculture and went, if we reduce all the other sectors to zero, electric cars, wind, we are left with an agricultural sector and it's impossible to do anything. Am I still here? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. It told me that Zoom crashed, but okay, I'll continue talking. We looked at those 13, 15 years at the agricultural sector, and the conclusion was, if we reduce all the other sectors to zero, we are left with 20% of our emissions left. We only need to reduce by 80%. That's it. We're not gonna look at agriculture. It's complex, it's difficult, natural processes, biological process, we'll just leave it at that. That's certainly not where we are today. In Denmark, we're of course part of the ETS. We're looking into ETS2 with the expansion of ETS and maybe even expanding ETS to the agricultural sector. Of course, that's in the very initial stages and we don't know how it can even work at a European level. But we're also, of course, part of the effort sharing regulation, so the sectors outside the ETS. And in Denmark, agriculture fills a very large part of our emissions. We are an agricultural country, there's no doubt about it. 60% of our area is agricultural land. So today, 35% of our total emissions are from agriculture and forestry. And when I say agriculture and forestry, it's actually primarily agriculture. And if we look into the future, we see this development of the rest of society with reducing emissions as we move towards 2030. There's a Danish goal of 70% reduction by 2030 with regards to, for the whole economy or for all emissions. And as we can see, the orange line at the bottom is the expected emissions from the agricultural sector. So they are flat and they have been flat for a fairly long time. We have an agriculture which is becoming more efficient, which is producing more food, but it finds it very hard to reduce its emissions. Whereas the rest of the sector, certainly with the closure of our coal plants, introduction of solar and wind power, has enabled the reduction of emissions. So how to bring about it? There was, and Daddy talked about it, we've had an expert panel looking into issues, and the expert panel first 2 years ago presented plans which then came into a political agreement on taxing emissions from the industrial sector on top of the ETS, because we're looking at what does ETS achieve, how does that correlate with our 70% reduction, and the conclusion was that ETS doesn't deliver enough. We need more. So we're actually going to impose a tax on top of ETS for our industrial sector. This expert panel, which presented the findings regarding industry and has now led to an agreement on increasing taxation on industry. We are at the moment waiting. We have been waiting for 2 years, but we think they will come with their proposal how to tax agriculture separately from ETS and how to reduce emissions. It's not a given that they will produce a carbon tax, but we certainly argue that it's the best and the cheapest way of achieving reductions within the agricultural sector. There are some discussions in Denmark as to, is it best if we tax the production or should we actually tax consumers? We just had a report where we pointed to that the marginal Danish consumer emits 13 tons a year of emissions, and that's of course relative to a global citizen that emits 3 tons and the goal of reducing to 2 tons. So there are also strong arguments to, shouldn't we also tax our consumption? But actually, and our point of view is actually, why not do both? But our focus at the moment is very much on how can we impose a carbon tax on agriculture. But of course, what we, and the 2 previous speakers also talked about, how does that relate to, for instance, leakage, competitiveness? Is it even possible? to have a tax on agriculture. How can we even measure the emissions? Because, you know, it's easy enough with a car. We buy some fuel. We know that if we burn the fuel, we know exactly how much carbon is emitted to the atmosphere. But every single cow might have a divergent emission. You might have one cow emitting equivalent of 4 tons, another cow emitting 3 tons. Is it even fair to have a taxation on something which is so uncertain? The good news, in some ways, is that the agricultural industry is very carbon intensive. They emit a lot of carbon relative to how much they earn, and which actually makes it somehow, as an economist, easier to advocate, because the price paid by society by reducing emissions is relatively low. Of course, if you have a sector with relatively low emissions and high level of earnings, you can very quickly run into very high costs. But as an economist looking at this, well, very high emissions, we don't need to actually, even if at a cost of a small amount of consumption or production, the gain is relatively large because it's such an carbon intensive sector. Yes. When we look at the agricultural sector, we've actually been able to talk a lot about this. This is not something we've arrived at easily. It's actually able, certainly in the Danish agricultural sector, to separate it into key sources of emissions. Where do the emissions in the agricultural sector come from? And we can separate it into these 4 major categories. 1, peatlands, or organic earth, where there's, in Denmark, we would be a marsh if it wasn't for our agricultural and the drainage we have. So these carbon-rich soils emit a lot of emissions. Converting them back into marshland will actually reduce the emissions from peatlands a lot. We have cattle, of course, major emitter of emissions. We have the manure coming from the animal industry, and we have the fertilizer that we spread on our fields. And actually separating those 4 will ballpark cover 85% of total emissions. And we actually argue that we can start by introducing a tax on each of these sources, and a tax on each of these sources. And the reason why we I would say are happy about a tax is that we see there's a very low incentive to develop new solutions. That's a great advantage of a tax, that it opens up a market for solutions, because in this area, there's very obvious for the agricultural sector that, you know, they can work on having more efficient cows, more efficient milk production, but there's very little incentive to develop climate solutions. They talk a lot about climate solutions. Certain farmers work a lot about climate solutions, but we don't have the strong incentive to develop solutions. And that's very much where we'd like to move towards an agricultural sector which starts reducing. And we find that, as has also already been explained by the previous participants, that there are strong values for carbon tax, and that, which is of course also why we advocate a carbon tax. Of course, when we say a carbon tax, it would be a carbon tax which would rise very slowly over time. It would give the sector time to adapt. We could give support for the schemes that are needed to reduce emissions. And we can actually, for these 4 sectors that I pointed to, we can actually see that already today there are solutions. Looking at, for instance, the manure, treating the manure quickly, covering the manure would actually prevent methane from leaking into the atmosphere. So already there, you have specific solutions that are available. It's just a question of trying to implement them, but also, you know, putting, as I say, some kind of pressure on the sector to develop new solutions. So that's where we are as Concito today. It's a very hot discussion in Denmark because it's also part of our Danish identity as an agricultural country. You know, it's very part of how we see, we are a small open economy, as was previously described. The question of competitiveness, aren't we just pushing our emissions outside Denmark when we do this? Very shortly, we don't think that's the case, or there are ways in which leakage issues, as they're called, can be handled. I think those were my 10 minutes. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Torsten. So we are now going to invite our fourth speaker. So her name is Sigríður Ingibjörg Ingadóttir. She is currently the chief economist at BSRB, the Federation of State and Municipal Employees. And she is also a former member of the Icelandic Parliament, where she chairs the Committee of Health and Social Affairs and the Budget Committee. And the title of her talk is Just a Carbon Pricing Policy or a Just Carbon Pricing Policy? Sigríður, the screen is yours.
So, okay, so you can see and hear?
Please put it in presentation mode.
Yes, I will. It's okay. So thank you very much for the presentation. For my presentation, for the introduction, Brynhildur. And thank you, Daði, Matti, and Thorsten for very inspiring and insightful presentations.
Your slides are still not in presentation mode.
That's so strange. I will
maybe you're sharing the
stop
wrong.
here.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this okay?
No. Still not.
So strange. Okay.
Right.
Right. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I've never shared the screen before. No, I'm joking. So now we will.
No.
Okay.
So Sigríður, Hlynur will simply
Can you share my slides, Hlynur?
Yes. So Hlynur will share your slides.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
So now we can dive into the question, why a just carbon policy? Since we have cleared out those technical problems. As we have heard, economists do agree that carbon pricing policy is a fundamental way to create a market mechanism to reduce emissions. And I think we all agree on that. The IMF has found that the push in green investments combined with steadily rising carbon prices can, without harmful effects for global output levels, deliver needed emission reduction. But they also point out that the policies must consider the effects of carbon pricing on low-income households and job losses, and that revenues from carbon pricing can be recycled for more just social and economic outcome. So we could have the next slide. The concept of just transition is a key concept for green transition and was coined by trade unions in the US in the 80s when trade unions were demanding protection for displaced workers when toxic polluting industries were closed down. And the main ingredients of just transitions are maximizing the social and economic opportunities of climate action while minimizing and carefully managing the challenges. It's about respecting the fundamental principles of fundamental labor principles and rights, ensuring opportunities for reskilling and capacity building of workers, and a very important ingredient is a social dialogue where everyone impacted is considered. So that's why we are also from the trade unions very thankful to be here today. And so we can participate in the discussion about the future of carbon pricing in the Nordics. So the next one, the ILO has adopted the, no, it's, yes. Isn't it a next one? The ILO has adopted the concept of just transition, but the ILO is the only tripartite institution within the UN where governments, employees, and employers design principles and rules for the labor market. And the ILO adopted guidelines for just transition in 2015, and they have published several policy briefs on trying to advance just a transition. And the one that I am referring to is greening economic policies, where they, with literary review, suggest that carbon tax revenues can be channeled to activities with positive externalities such as green research and development, green infrastructure, and income distribution. And of course, that's the goal of just transition, not to increase inequality, but rather to decrease it. And to the next slide, I'm just taking a little example from Iceland, and this is a very simplified picture. The red column is carbon tax on fuel in Iceland. The dark blue is VAT exemption on electric vehicles and plug-in electric vehicles. It's subsidies. And public transport, the light blue one, is subsidies from the state to public transport in the last 6 years. And carbon tax was, as Daði said, introduced in 2010 in Iceland, and subsidies for electric and plug-in hybrid cars were introduced in 2012. The goal for the subsidies are 100,000 clean energy cars in Iceland in 2030. And by that year, the plan is to ban import of cars with combustion engines. But the policy didn't include any measures to reduce the amount of cars in general, and did not include increased support for public transport by the state. So the goal seems to first and foremost to have been to change the composition of the car fleet, not to reduce the amount of cars. I think that's the unexpected outcome. So we can see the next picture. There you have, here we have number of cars per capita in Iceland, and it has increased since the policy of subsidies of clean cars was introduced. These are per 100 inhabitants, I took it 70 to 80 years old. So these are the people most likely to be driving in Iceland at that age. And it increased from around 68 cars per 100 inhabitants to 81. And the clean energy cars are pure addition. So the combustion has it might have reduced because of more energy efficient cars, but we still have the problem with a large fleet of cars with combustion engines. And as Matti, with his excellent data on the car fleet of Finland, showed us that the average age of cars there is 13 years. I don't know what, I think it's quite high average age here in Iceland as well. So we will be dealing with this car fleet for the coming decade, for the coming 2 decades at least. So what we know is that the higher income families, households were buying the clean cars, or proportionally higher. It was mainly the high end of the income, while those with lower income were paying proportionally higher carbon taxes of their income. But we don't have any, here I'm generalizing, because we don't have any real data on this, because it hasn't been analyzed. So the next slide. A German policy brief made for the German government talks about 2 kinds of impacts for distribution or distributional impacts of pricing policy, carbon pricing policies, and it's on increased. It can affect through increased expenditures of the households or chasing the income. And they also point out that the more cost can be passed on to consumers, the less carbon price will affect income, and the more it will affect households' expenditures. And in the next slide, it says that household expenditures are well documented. In absolute terms, the high-income households consume more, and therefore they pay a higher carbon price, but the lower-income families are paying higher proportion of their income on those taxes. But it's not only income that we have to think about, it's also gender or where you live and all types of socio-demographic attributes. So if we go to the next slide. Yes, we hear in this German study or policy brief, they give 3 examples of how you can change the distributional effects of the carbon tax. And they give examples of direct or lump sum transfers, subsidies, and tax reforms. And they give some examples of for direct lump sums. They give examples from California about climate credits on electricity bills, but that are designed not to affect the price signal of the carbon tax. They also talk about subsidies, and the design of the subsidies decides how it affects the price signal, how it affects adapting new technology to reduce emissions. And then they talk about tax reforms that can compensate low-income households, for example, by introducing tax credit that can be targeted to low-income households by different criteria and can be either per person or households. So there are many ways that you can rechannel income from carbon tax to decrease the effects on or the distributional impact. The Nordic Council of Ministers in the next slide has made a policy brief about the distributional impacts for gender. And if you assume that the consumption patterns of men and women are the same when it comes to transport, then it would affect women more negatively than men because of the gender income gap. But since the consumption pattern is not the same, it affects men more when a carbon price is introduced. And women are also more positive to reducing the use of car. But they also point out that climate policies, especially waste policies, but we also have to consider it when it comes to other policies, can increase the amount of unpaid work that often is carried out by women. In Iceland, the higher proportion of men are registered car owners as in the other countries, and they also drive longer distances to work. But we also have to remember that women in Iceland are more likely to be the only breadwinner in the family. And so that has also to be taken into consideration. Then we have the next slide about distributional impacts for different social groups. And a Swedish study combined footprint analysis, socio-demographic and geographic analysis to assess the distributional impact of low carbon transition policies from the perspective of wealth, access, and health. And they conclude that the impact of the additional factors such as age and access to services should be considered for low carbon transition policy measures and transitional assistance policies. We saw a very interesting data from Matti, where different data sources had been combined. And in the next slide, we see a picture because in this study, they used a marketing tool to better understand different social groups. And this marketing tool is like segmentation of the population by consumption patterns. And they combined it with other data to estimate the economic and social price of carbon pricing policy. I am, of course, not advocating for this special marketing tool. I'm only using it as an example of how, by combining data from different sources, we can better design transitional assistance policies for carbon pricing policies. Or in other words, we can make effective carbon pricing policies that are potentially politically feasible, just, and will not increase income inequalities. And I think Matti also gave an excellent example of that. And I'm very impressed by the data that Finland produces. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now we have actually reached the end of the webinar. And I want to end by two things. I want to remind you of the schedule of the webinars that will follow. And the schedule will appear here in just a minute. Here we go. So the next webinar is actually tomorrow, at 8:30 Central European Time. It's organized by Turkey Consulting and IVL, and will focus on biofuels, in particular the use of biofuel blending obligations and the alternatives that the Nordic countries have available. Then on the 29th, we'll have another webinar hosted by Cicero, focusing on decarbonizing the Nordic power system. On the 2nd of October, we have a webinar by Concito that focuses on consumption-based analysis. And finally, on the 3rd of October, we have a webinar hosted by IVL and Turkey Consulting on carbon capture and storage and CTR. But I want to conclude by simply thanking the Nordic Council of Ministers for funding this initiative, all the speakers for their excellent talks, and you attendees for your participation. Thank you so much.